Imagination is a realm. In the Corpus Hermeticum in Book 5, there's a passage that talks about how whatever we want to call God, the big mind of or the big intelligence of the cosmos or universal mystery or what have you, that it doesn't appear by itself to human minds. And it's referred to also as the unmanifest and the unborn, but it doesn't show up by itself. When it does appear, quote, it brings all images to the mind in imagination. For imagination is nothing but beginning. What does that mean? So one way of understanding this is through Carl Jung's work with what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. He went through a turbulent period of a number of years where all kinds of impulses and old business and wounds and images and other things were bubbling up in his mind. And he used imagination to let it have a voice. And he ends up calling this active imagination. He might have got the term from the French scholar Henri Corbin, who had studied Islamic Gnosticism. And let me just say here real quick that Jungian psychology is so permeated with Hermeticism that we could actually consider it an update of that, a psychological update of Hermeticism. So when these inner wrestlings were going on, Jung did his very best to let the characters and voices that came up speak. And at one point, there were two who surfaced, and he identified them as figures out of folklore. So one was Philemon, who's in Jung's universe is kind of a wizard figure. And then the other one was Salome, the infamous dancer from the Bible who asked for the head of John the Baptist. So they showed up together, and this puzzled Jung, such different characters. And so while in the active imagination, he tried to interpret them, and this was a mistake. And so at that point, Philemon brusquely tells him, "We are real and not images." Very surprising to Jung. And what this taught him, and what he writes about later in several places, is that what we might call the imaginal, following Corbin, the imaginal isn't just us making things up, that the figures of the imaginal, if we let them speak, have their own opinions, their own kind of reality, their own personalities. And so for some of us, this seems kind of dangerous. It sounds like the old multiple personality pathology. But Jung writes that this is actually true for all of us. And that the main job of what he called the ego, which is not pride, but the conscious self, the sense of I or me, that its main job isn't to dominate and control the rest of the psyche, but to mediate so all these different voices can come to the table and say what they want and talk to each other. So all of this reflects Hermetic tradition and practice. So if we take the Islamic Gnostic side for some examples, there are different names this intermediate realm between the spiritual world and the physical world go by. So Alam al-Mithal is one name. It's also called Herkalia, the eighth climb. Sheikh Ahmed Asai calls it the interworld. And so these people knew about it. Ibn Arabi calls it Hadrat Khayalia, which means something like imaginative dignity. Corbin refers to active imagination as being able to access it. So it's a realm from this perspective. It's a layer of reality. And the figures in this realm speak in their own language, which is the language of symbolism. They speak in metaphors, not usually in just straight out linear language. So for instance, when you have a dream and a dream voice says something, always look for this symbolic meaning, because dreams tend not to speak with linear everyday language. They tend to speak in metaphors. So in the Corpus Hermeticum also is the need to discern between types of imagination. So there's the type of imagination where we just get lost in our fantasies and we never make firm decisions, we never get grounded, we get carried away. These days, they're the images of the occasional gamer who just gets lost in the game and it becomes their whole life online, So there's a passage in book 15 of the Corpus Hermeticum that makes this distinction. And it was made in later evolutions of Hermeticism as well by different people. So Coleridge makes the distinction, Tolkien and others who were influenced by Hermeticism, even if they didn't identify as Hermetic. And so in this book, Hermes is talking to his son, Tat. In this particular dialogue, Tat is his son. Tat is short for Thoth. So in a way, it's backwards because it's actually Thoth that comes before Hermes Trismegistus. But in any case, Hermes Trismegistus says, and when the fantasy has an influence from above, then it is an imitation of truth. In other words, it performs that mediating function we just talked about. But without that operation from above, it is left a lie. It's also a distinction that William Blake makes, and a number of other people talk about this too. I think of it sometimes as, do you have the fantasy or do the fantasies have you? So we can appreciate some of the importance of this when we think about things like this. After the disaster of 9/11 in the States, there was a government body that investigated how this happened. What was this? And why didn't we see it coming? And there's all kinds of layers to this, right? Complex cultural and historical layers and all that. But I'm bringing this up because the conclusion of this government agency was interesting. It said that the overriding factor was failure of imagination. Failure of imagination. This term is so popular now that it pops up recurrently everywhere. And when you see situations over and over again where somebody didn't anticipate something really obvious and then it happens, failure of imagination, right? So one of the importances of imagination is that it allows us to imagine the consequences of our plans and actions before we implement them. So without that reflective space, we're liable to just make messes. We're liable to just take a complex system, try to make a linear intervention in it, and have it go completely haywire. So in part, imagination can help us face the complexities of the reality that we live in. But the other thing I wanted to say about imagination, and its many, many uses, we cannot go good places with moving toward the kind of world we want to live in, the kind of relationships we want to have with each other, our ideas of justice and how to implement those. Real equity, where no one gets left behind. We can't do any of those things unless we can imagine how. So in some ways, the fix-it mentality that characterizes our efforts at reform is putting the cart before the horse. We're worried about solutions, and there's plenty of solutions out there, how to fix this and how to repair that and all that. But unless we imagine where we want to be, then we get stuck in simply adjusting what already exists a little bit this way or a little bit that way. So to the extent that we can relearn how to dream together, then we can hope to go in good places. When the vision and the dreaming come first, the tools and the implementation can then follow. So I want to leave you with another quotation. This one is from book 11 of the Corpus Hermeticum. And it gets at the sense of gnosis that's bound up in imagination. Sense as one within yourself the entire creation. Fire, water, the dry and the moist. Conceive yourself to be in all places at the same time. In earth, in the sea, in heaven. That you are not yet born, that you are within the womb, that you are young, old, dead, that you are beyond death. Conceive all things at once, times, places, actions, qualities, and quantities, and then you will understand God. Thanks.